Chapter 3. Doubling Down on Slavery. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, the news sent shock waves through the country. The reverberations were so intense that even a 3-year-old boy standing outside of his family's home in Augusta, Georgia, never forgot the moment he heard the news. That child, Woodrow Wilson, would himself win the presidency a half century later, but his attention was captivated that fall day by another possibility. As he hovered at the family gate, he overheard a passerby make a prediction that he never forgot. This means war. War truly would have been a shocking thought for a young child, but such a threat was not unexpected for the country's adult citizens of 1860. Many could remember the years when the topic of slavery had become so controversial that members of Congress had agreed never to discuss it. They could recall that a bit of calm had arrived in 1850 with the compromise that granted new states the right to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. But before the decade was out, they now they know of legislators who literally come to blows, as had residents in the territory of Kansas over whether Kansas would join the country as a free state or as one where slavery was permitted. It is important to realize that in 1860, the configuration of political party viewpoints was the opposite of today. Lincoln represented the newly formed Republican Party, which at the time was a progressive body whose members wanted to stop the spread of slavery into new states. Democrats were the conservatives of the era. Their opinions on slavery varied, with the party's greatest support occurring where slavery continued to be practiced. 7 months before the election, Southern Democrats had become so furious about their party's wavering support of slavery that they had formed a regional offshoot and nominated their own candidate for president. By the time voters, which during that era meant white men only, went to the polls that fall, there were 4 presidential candidates to choose from: 2 Democrats, another conservative, and Lincoln. Lincoln won. This outcome provoked a furious response among the losers. Although Republicans had only challenged the expansion of slavery, not its restriction in states where it already existed, those who depended upon enslaved labor felt threatened. 20 states had joined the nation's original 13. More were bound to follow with the country's westward expansion. Indeed, Kansas would become the 34th state within months of the election, one where slavery was prohibited. Because Republicans planned for all future states to be free of slavery, leaders in the 15th so-called slave states realized they would increasingly become outnumbered. Even if there wasn't the will to abolish slavery everywhere yet, when that time came, the South would be unable to stop it. States in the Deep South decided that drastic measures were required. Rather than accept the election outcome, they began to organize a new national government, one where the future of slavery would never be in doubt. By the early 1861, 5 states had banded together: Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Their state governments declared their intention to secede or withdraw from the United States of America, and they sent spokesmen to recruit other states to join them. By February, they gained 2 new allies, Florida and Texas. These original 7 defectors were home to the deepest concentrations of slavery in America. Some had counties where as many as 70, 80, or even more than 90% of their population were enslaved. Together, They began to form the Confederate States of America and started drafting a new constitution to govern it, one that approved of slavery. George Junkin, the steadfast Unionist and college president in Lexington, Virginia, was beside himself as these events unfolded. He became so concerned that secession that he started teaching a course in constitutional history at Washington College. He instructed his class that the U.S. Constitution did not include a mechanism for secession. What the states in the Deep South were doing was illegal. But his lessons failed to sway his students, many of whom favored having Virginia join the Confederacy. As time passed, students became increasingly bold in expressing their opinions. At one point, someone scrawled the intended insult of Lincoln Junkin outside of the door of his classroom. In late March 1861, a group hoisted a pro-secession flag above the campus. Junkin promptly ordered the flag removed and locked it in his classroom. But the dispute did not end there. Within days, students had entered the classroom through an unlocked window, stolen the flag, and raised it again. This time, after retrieving the flag, Junkin set it on fire. As it burned, he insisted, "So perish all efforts to dissolve this glorious union." Junkin may have hoped his words would prove true, but even his wishes were being tested. Some 100 miles away, in Virginia's state capital, Richmond, the newly forming Confederate states were continuing to recruit others to join their alliance, and they were particularly keen to add Virginia to their fold. The state held strategic importance given its proximity to the nation's capital. It also was home to a notable political leader, valuable military resources, and considerable wealth, including an abundance of enslaved people. If the Confederacy could pull Virginia to its side, it would become a stronger nation, and it would have a dependable supply of enslaved workers. In February 1861, as George Junkin lectured his college students, a group of 152 delegates began to meet in Richmond to debate Virginia's fate. All were male and all were white, just like the voters who had elected them. Most were Unionists. Virginians were proud of the role their ancestors had played in founding the United States of America, and they wanted its union to be preserved. Only about a quarter of the men at the meeting favored secession. Delegates settled in for a long debate. Each were expected to speak, but so were representatives from the Confederacy. Given Virginia's importance, the breakaway states had sent three of their most persuasive promoters to address its secession convention. This delegation of commissioners, as they were called, included John Smith Preston, a South Carolinian who had been born in Virginia. The year before, Preston was among the Southern delegates who had withdrawn from the Democratic Party's presidential nominating convention over the body's position of limiting the expansion of slavery. This walkout has split the votes of conservatives in the fall election and helped secure Lincoln's victory. The other commissioners speaking with Preston were a Georgia Supreme Court justice named Henry Louis Benning and an attorney from Mississippi, Fulton Anderson. The three arrived in Richmond just as the new Confederate government was forming. Jefferson Davis was sworn in as Confederacy president on February 18, 1861, in the Montgomery, Alabama, the new country's first capital. Davis, a West Point graduate, brought considerable experience to this new role, having previously performed his distinction as a U.S. officer in the Mexican-American War, served as Secretary of War for President Franklin Pierce, and represented Mississippi in the U.S. House and Senate. Meanwhile, the campaign to expand the Confederacy continued. Virginia's visiting commissioners spent 2 days delivering their secession speech. Each speaker reinforced the other, and all of them emphasized the many calamities that would befall Virginia and any other state of if its enslaved residents were ever set free. Anderson, who spoke first, made the case that progressive Republicans would be certain to overturn slavery in the South, making that reason number one to succeed. Benning, an enslaver of 90 people, spoke next. If slavery were to be abolished, he warned, the Southern economy would collapse. So would its world order, an outcome he presented as equally frightening, if not more so. Everything would be turned upside down, with blacks seizing power from whites and ruling over them as judges and jurors. Worst of all, Benning predicted, the purity of the white race will be threatened by black men having sexual intercourse with white women. That is the fate with which abolition will bring upon the white race, he told his audience, ignoring the fact that white men had been forcing themselves upon enslaved black women and girls for centuries by then. For all these reasons, Benning concluded Southern states should stand together as one and, if necessary, go to war to preserve slavery. It would be a glorious and worthy fight, he predicted. In such a cause, cowards will become men, men heroes, and heroes gods. John Smith Preston gave the trio's closing argument. Slavery and the South were so intertwined, he maintained, that it was worth leaving the United States in order to preserve the practice. None but an equal race can labor at the North. None but a subject race will labor at the South, he explained. In other words, the nature of work in the North could be undertaken by the people who were free. The South was different. There, the work had to be done by people who had no choice in the matter. A subject race, as he called enslaved blacks. Preston was greeted with extended applause when he concluded his lengthy speech. Then he, Fulton, and Benning withdrew so the delegates could debate their options. So it went state by state during the months following Lincoln's election as dozens of commissioners crafted persuasive letters and spoke to leaders in the southern states about their possible secession. They traveled as far afield as Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, all of which permitted slavery. Wherever they went, they made the issue of race a rallying theme. On December 17, 1860, a commissioner from Mississippi warned legislatures in Georgia that whites would be better off dead than face a world where blacks lived alongside them as equals. The state seceded the next month. North Carolinians were similarly warned. Secession was necessary to protect whites from having to submit to the degradation of being reduced to an equality with the formerly enslaved. In May 1861, North Carolina became the 10th state to join the Confederacy. George Junkin wasn't the only Unionist in Lexington, Virginia. Both of the county's representatives at the state secession convention, James B. Dorman and Samuel McDowell Moore, were Unionists too. While debates continued in Richmond, this pair corresponded with a fellow lawyer back home named James D. Davidson, as did the state's governor, John Letcher, who was also from the area. These men weren't just friends and Unionists like Junkin, they were enslavers. Today, it may seem illogical for enslavers to have been patriots, but at the time, many Southern whites were pro-United States, pro-slavery in the same breath. At the request of Governor Letcher, Davidson traveled to Washington, D.C. to survey the capital's political scene while his friends were engaged in Richmond. He arrived a few days before the presidential inauguration, which at the time took place in early March. Although Davidson did not stay for the March 4th ceremony, he did have the opportunity to meet the president-elect. I was agreeably disappointed by Abraham Lincoln, Davidson wrote the governor, as I had been most unfavorably impressed against him from the accounts of him in papers. In other words, Davidson liked him. On the day of Lincoln's inauguration, Davidson wrote James Dorman that he was convinced the policy of Lincoln will be pacific or peaceful. 10 days after Lincoln had been sworn in, Davidson wrote Governor Letcher again, I am stronger than ever now in my faith that all yet be well. 3 weeks after Lincoln's inauguration, the Confederacy's Vice President Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia reaffirmed the founding principle of his new nation. Stevens, a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives, spoke on March 21, 1861. His remarks have become known as the Cornerstone Speech because he used the image of a cornerstone, that essential first block that supports the structure above it, when discussing the importance of slavery to the South. Stevens told fellow Georgians in Savannah that the Confederacy's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, the subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. As far as Stevens was concerned, the superiority of whites over blacks was unquestioned, and slavery was the metaphorical cornerstone upon which the Confederacy would be built. After the war, Stevens would insist that his so-called cornerstone speech had been misquoted. On June 5, 1865, while imprisoned, he wrote in his diary, It's proper for me to state that the speech was extemporaneous. The reporter's notes, which were very imperfect, were hastily corrected by me and were published without further revision, and several glaring errors. Furthermore, he suggested he hadn't said anything controversial. The status of the African race in the new Constitution was just where it was in the old. I affirmed and meant to affirm nothing else in the Savannah speech. 3 years later, in 1868, he would reinforce this point by writing that the war arose from different and opposing ideas as to the nature of what is known as the general government. The contest was between those who held it to be strictly federal in its character and those who maintained that it was thoroughly national. Strictly federal in its character and those who maintained that it was thoroughly national. He suggested that this tension had created conflict throughout the country's history, and slavery just happened to be the question on which these antagonistic principles were finally brought into action and active collision with each other on the field of battle. Slavery was, he wrote, but a drop in the ocean compared with larger questions of federalism or states' rights. The problem with Stevens' claims is that he didn't seem to have been misquoted at all in Savannah in 1861. He had spoken similarly the week before in Atlanta. During that speech, He had also taken pains to differentiate between the U.S. and Confederate constitutions. He declared that seceding states had solemnly discarded the pestilent heresy of fancy politicians that all men of all races were equal. Instead, he said, Confederates had made African inequality and subordination and the equality of white men the chief cornerstone of the Southern Republic. In other words, blacks were inferior to whites, and whites had a right to subordinate or re-enslave them. On April 4th, 1861, a month after Lincoln's inauguration and soon after Stephen's speeches, Virginia's delegates held their first vote on the question of secession. The motion sank in a resounding defeat. Only 45 representatives voted in favor of joining the Confederacy. 90 remained loyal to the United States, with others absent or abstaining. But rather than adjourn the convention, delegates continued to gather, make speeches, and monitor unfolding events. The vote against these secessions was a serious blow for Virginians who made their living by selling enslaved people to states in the Deep South. These traffickers knew that the new Confederate Constitution would only allow such transactions to continue if they lived in the Confederacy. It would be impossible for them to stay in business if Virginia remained loyal to the United States. Such an outcome was unacceptable. As far as they were concerned, there was, however, hope because the secession convention remained in session. It was possible for Virginia's traffickers to begin pressuring the delegates to change their minds. And so they did just that. Samuel McDowell Moore was furious about the traffickers' lobbying campaign. The interest of these people is entirely with the seceded states, he wrote. James D. Davidson on April 6, 1861. I have reason to believe they are spending their money freely in order to influence the public's mind in favor of immediate secession. Moore reported that traffickers had assembled mobs to heckle Unionists at the convention and were buying up newspapers across the state so that their readers would begin to see anti-union articles. Even the local paper in Shenandoah Valley had been purchased, he noted, and it seemed likely to switch its support from remaining in the United States to secession. In short, traffickers were using their wealth to distort the reporting of events by the news media. They hoped their manipulation of facts would lead to Virginia's secession and the continuation of their profitable trade. This influence-building campaign concerned Governor John Letcher, too, but he wrote Davidson that he doubted it would succeed. I cannot believe that an all-wise and just God would permit these conspirators to succeed in overturning the best government that the wit of man has ever devised. He was sure that nothing could destroy his beloved country. They are doomed to certain and overwhelming defeat, Letcher told Davidson. Now mark that prediction. Letcher, however, did not anticipate the impact of what would happen next. In early April, the U.S. government announced plans to resupply federal forces trapped at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Confederacy responded by demanding that the federal forces evacuate the fort. After a U.S. commander refused, the Confederates attacked on April 12, 1861. Lincoln countered this act of aggression by issuing a call for federal troops to confront the Confederate rebels. Every U.S. state was expected to contribute its fair share of men for the force. Every U.S. state was expected to contribute its fair share of men for the force. Else, every U.S. state would they send their own citizens into battle against the South. Having voted not to secede on April 4th, the state's delegates turned around and voted in favor of secession on April 17th. This time, 88 delegates supported secession, almost as many as had previously opposed it. Rockridge County's James Dorman, who had arrived at the convention a Unionist, was among those voting to secede. He regarded Lincoln's move to defend the fort in South Carolina an arrogant and infamous usurpation of power. In other words, Dorman thought Lincoln didn't have the right to use federal power against a former state. The 55 men who disapproved of secession, including Moore, were outnumbered. All that remained was that for the state's voters to confirm their support of secession, which they did overwhelmingly on May 23, 1861. Voters out of 1,729 rejected the call for secession. Opposition to secession was strongest in Virginia's northern counties near the U.S. Capitol and in its western mountainous regions, where slavery was less prevalent. Those westernmost counties would later regroup and rejoin the United States as a new state, West Virginia. Before the end of May, the Confederacy had accepted Virginia's invitation to use Richmond as its new national capital, and Jefferson Davis had taken up residence there. That same month, Arkansas and North Carolina had also decided to join the Confederacy. In June, Tennessee became the 11th and final state to withdraw from the United States and join the Confederate States of America. By then, Washington College found itself short a president. There had been a third incident on campus involving a renegade flag, and this one had pushed George Junkin to his limit. On April 17th, the day of the second convention vote in Richmond, students raised a new secession flag over the campus in a show of support. Junkin turned to faculty members for backup and threatened to quit unless they sided with him in taking it down. They did not. The flag remained. An infuriated Junkin told the students, "I never will hear a recitation or deliver a lecture under a rebel flag. The class is dismissed." Then Junkin resigned his post, packed up his family belongings, and within days left town. He returned to his home state of Pennsylvania and contemplated what had become of his country. Eventually, he would write a book analyzing the legality of secession. His conclusion: there was no legal basis for it at all. This work, Political Fallacies, an examination of the false assumptions and refutation of the sophistical reasonings which have brought on this Civil War, was published in 1863. 2 years after his departure from Virginia. When Junkin left Lexington, only the youngest of his 3 daughters joined him. The middle daughter had died. Her husband, Thomas J. Jackson, had remarried and was preparing to go to war for the Confederacy. So was husband of his eldest daughter, Margaret Junkin Preston, who continued to reside in Lexington. Junkin's 2 elder sons lived in the North and rallied behind the federal government. One joined the ranks of the U.S. Army as a military surgeon. His 2 younger sons remained in the South and stood by the Confederacy, with one of them volunteering for the new nation's army. Brothers divided against brothers, fathers against children. Such is the disorder of the world when a country is torn by civil war. Lie number 4. Confederate soldiers behaved honorably. U.S. soldiers were brutes. The nobleness of the Confederate soldier became a central tenet of lost cause propaganda. In this telling of the past, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and other generals were righteous gentlemen, almost saintly in character, who had fought with God on their side. Rank and file soldiers were praised for faithfully following their leaders into battle. This glorification allowed for a face-saving embrace of returning soldiers. Veterans could be welcomed home as heroes, not failures. By emphasizing the soldier's character in battle, it was easier to ignore the fact that the South had fought to preserve the institution of slavery, and that many of its soldiers had themselves been enslavers. The noble soldier construction also ignored the reality that numerous Confederate officers had betrayed former military oaths of allegiance to the United States, and that all soldiers had fought against their mother country as rebels. In addition, this tenet of the lost cause ignored the fact that tens of thousands of Confederates had changed their minds, deserted their posts, and even crossed battle lines to take up arms against the South. Federal soldiers, in contrast, were slandered by lost cause lies as having been vicious and unmannerly. Ulysses S. Grant, a general of the U.S. Army, was nicknamed Butcher Grant by white Southerners who accused him of sending soldiers recklessly into battle. This assertion disregarded how Lee unnecessarily sacrificed countless soldiers himself, such as during his increasingly doomed defense of Richmond and Petersburg during the final year of the war. Thousands of lives could have been saved if he accepted the inevitability of defeat sooner. It also obscured how Confederates had behaved ruthlessly and immorally by committing such acts as the murder of black prisoners of war. Lie number 4.